When it comes to forming new habits, there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach. The most important facet for forming a new habit is the person by habit interaction, which is a type of attitude by treatment effect. A person can be good at forming an exercise habit, but then may struggle to form a good writing or productivity habit. Another person might be very strong at forming a writing habit and then struggle to form exercise habits. This attitude by treatment effect feature habit research. And I explain in this series of studies how I came about discovering this effect, how it relates to habit difficulty, and then how we can use strategies to overcome the habit by person difficulty. And then I talk about a few potential further lines of research that this informs. My first step was figuring out what is more relevant for forming a new habit. Is it the person, the habit, or is it the person by habit interaction? I recruited participants to form two new habits, one at a time and never doing both at the same time. And I randomly ordered which one they started first. One of the habits was drinking water in the morning, which is very simple because people are already used to drinking water. It shouldn't be that difficult. The only new part is the time demand. The other habit was flossing before bed. This habit ought to be a little bit harder because it takes some technical skill and it's not very pleasant or fun to do when you're just starting out. I had a fully cross design. Each participant formed every habit for 45 days. I then ran a generalizability theory test to see the relative importance of each of these three facets for forming a new habit. What I found was that only 4% of the variability was explained by the habit choice of either flossing or drinking water, which shows that it's not the habit a person picks wasn't very informative just by itself. But the individual explains 20% of the variance, and the habit by person interaction explains 41% of the variance, leading me to believe that it really depends on the person, which have the rate of development for a new habit. So I was initially looking at difficulty the wrong way. The habit by itself is not a good indication of difficulty, but it looks like the person by habit interaction is the most relevant variable. So to further test this idea out, I looked at the ability of easiness of a habit, a person's perception of easiness, and then that person's later ability to form that habit. So I had participants for this study spend 8 weeks forming a habit of journaling on Google Docs. Before and after this 8-week period, they came into the lab and they wrote for 30 minutes with me or one of my research assistants. And then in that session, I used 2 measures of mental workload, which is basically, how hard are you working, or how difficult was this task for you of journaling? And then I include 1 physiological measure of workload, which is blood flow velocity in the middle cerebral artery of the brain, which means that the faster the blood's flowing in the brain, the harder the person's working. So I tested this idea with all 3 measures. Overall, I found support that easiness leads to habit growth for 1 of the self-report measures, and then also for the blood flow measure. So what I find that in general, people who find a habit easy to do are also able to form it into a habit a little bit easier, which makes sense. But it led me to wonder a little bit about how can we overcome the difficulty barrier. Like when a person finds a habit that's difficult, can we use a strategy for overcoming that? And I tested this theory at the much larger level of a person's life goal to form probably multiple good habits. If you're a Tim Ferriss Show listener, you probably want to form about 50 new habits. I let participants pick among 5. They could form any 2, and they entailed either writing, reading, learning a new language, programming, or meditating. They picked 2, and then I assigned them to a condition of either forming both habits at the same time for 12 weeks or do them one by one. And that they spend 6 weeks forming the first habit. And then after 6 weeks, they add the second habit while continuing the first. So in total, they spend 12 weeks in one and 6 weeks in the other. So that way, they're focusing on one habit. Then once it's probably a little bit easier for them, then they can go add the second habit. So there are 2 ideas for 2 hypotheses. That one is the strategy could enhance habit growth. So maybe forming one by one can make it a little bit easier to form a new habit. And the other idea was that the strategy might lead to compliance and that they are having more success in doing the habits, that they're only to do one, focus on one at a time versus focusing on 2 the entire time. What I found was that the strategy didn't really matter for predicting habit growth, but it did matter for predicting compliance with the habits, that people were much more likely to do the habits when they're focusing on one at a time rather than focusing on forming both at the same time. So for people who are struggling to form new habits, it might be a good idea to form one habit at a time, is what these results mean. This line of research is just the basis for many more research questions. And one of the questions is that can we develop super habit formers from this framework? And that if we have a person form habits that are easier for them at first, say they form like a few habits they find easy, and then they could then build up to forming habits that they find harder. So that could be a way of training the ability to form new habits. Another line of research could focus on breaking down difficult habits. Remember, I only broke down habits at the larger level of forming habits in general, but we could isolate one habit a person finds to be difficult and see if breaking it down to steps. For example, flossing 1 or 2 teeth and then working your way up, to start off, then working your way up to flossing your whole mouth over a month. That could be a way to start simple, then to eventually build up to doing the habit at full dosage. All of this data points to the idea that there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all model for forming new habits. It really depends on the person and the habit to find a good fit. And this finding ought to guide future research to help people be more successful in forming new habits.